Women of the South. During the late 19th century, we're going to see that women are increasingly becoming even more active in reform movements. And these can include movements from like women's suffrage to social welfare to labor legislation. Now, the thing is, in the North, a lot of these women are going to build on a lot of the antebellum activist traditions that come from before the Civil War. We've seen this before. The women's rights movement really begins with the abolitionist movement. And so women of the North already have a tradition they can hearken back to. Whereas Southern women don't have this really. And in fact, a lot of Southern women were really ambivalent about independence. A lot of women in the South had to care for themselves as well as their families because so many men had died in the Civil War. And this had made, on one hand, some women were, determined to never have to rely on a man again, but others, quite frankly, would have liked a little less independence. The other thing is, what makes this hard for women in the South to push for things like women's rights is that Southern white men were complicated. The thing is, they had really been shaken by the defeat of the Civil War, and there's this element of they don't see the Civil War as something that is a lesson to be learned from. And so to try to justify it, a lot of Southern white men are going to respond with things like alcoholism and violence. They see it as like a crusade, and now they're like, oh, we failed to win for the South, but now that, all these black people have been freed and everything, white men in the South suddenly started making black men the enemy. And who did they need to protect from black men? That would be white women. And so for white women in the South to try to challenge this perception would have threatened this newfound image and basically one of the few things that Southern white men had confidence about in this time. And I'm not trying to justify that or anything like that, but I want you guys to see what this issue was at this time period. So basically, Southern white women are going to understand this, they're going to recognize it, and so we don't see them mounting the same kind of extensive reform campaigns like women did in the North. And we see some women actually being hostile to reform. A lot of times women were more inclined to try to reinforce their role than to really challenge it. That being said, women did get involved still in reform. So the thing is, a lot of times women in the South are going to use channels that had already been granted to them as acceptable for them to have power over, such as in the church. That's an extension of home, and it's therefore a natural place for a woman to be and a natural place for a woman to have authority. Because remember, they're supposed to be the moral superiors of men at this time period. Also keep in mind the South is the most church-going region of the country at this time, partly because they wanted to rationalize the loss and devastation of the Civil War. And so women are going to take advantage of the church's prominence. So a lot of reform movements in the South came specifically actually from the church. Here they might found mission societies, they might promote industrial education amongst the poor or help working class women become more self-sufficient. They might set up settlement houses. They wanted to very much promote middle class values to especially poor neighborhoods. And then the big one is going to be the WCTU, which is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Temperance reform. Temperance is basically wanting to abolish alcohol. The thing is, this was acceptable for women to fight for temperance because they framed it as a family issue. Because alcohol, they said, ruined families and victimized innocent women and children. And so the thing is, women in the South did get really involved in temperance. And so they would go visit schools and go visit prisons to address all of the evils of alcohol. The thing is, they visited these schools, they visited these prisons, and they were appalled by the terrible conditions they saw in these institutions. And this led them to start pushing for other reforms like educational reform and prison reform. The thing is, as women get more involved in reforms, they're going to recognize that they really can't achieve their goals unless they have the right to vote. We're also going to see when it comes to race, women of the South do not have the best track record. The thing is, while they might have been for reforms, they didn't really have interests in challenging class or racial inequalities. In fact, there's a lot of dedication of Southern women to commemorate the memory of the Confederate cause. A lot of the Confederate monuments and stuff that you still see up today were actually put there by women in the South. They were very much all about things like the proper burial for soldiers and making sure that they're suitably marketed and they're marked, and monuments and such. But all of this meant very much white solidarity. That was one of the most important parts of women getting involved in reform. And that you have this common heritage for white Southerners, whether you are a man or a woman. It was more important that you were white from their viewpoint. And this is when you get things like the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The UDC was made in 1894. They're like, oh, we're trying to preserve Southern history and honor its heroes. Never mind that Southern history was that of slavery and that its heroes were technically traitors to the Union with the Civil War and everything. The thing is, when we're looking at all this, while it is problematic, it is showing, it basically did offer a way for women in the South during this time period to hone their leadership skills, their organizational skills, and it's kind of preparing them to take on roles that are less traditional eventually. I also have to look at women's clubs. The thing is, a lot of women were joining women's clubs. A lot of times these were like church-sponsored organizations. You might even have a women's club or a women's guild at your church and such today. A lot of these are more like, they start as literacy groups or self-improvement groups, things like that. Not really interested in reform, but over time they start discussing political issues like child labor reform, educational improvement, prison reform, temperance. And so they start getting involved in these things. And the reason I want to bring this up is because you also see Black women have a lot of times their own women's clubs that very much paralleled those of white women. And they supported very similar things like daycare facilities for working mothers, settlement houses. A lot of times it was trying to help out like single Black women who were mothers. And of course, you have them all working on some level for women's suffrage. Now, the thing is, as much as you have these Black groups fighting for similar things as these white groups, rarely do they really interact. Now, you might have the occasional white woman expressing sympathy for Black women in private, but once again, it was really important for white women at this time period to maintain that white solidarity, especially in public. And so they were really unwilling to sacrifice their own reform agenda for the case of like racial reconciliation. And in fact, some white women during this time, such as like you see pictured here, Rebecca Felton, they're actually going to use racial solidarity as a weapon to get more women's rights. And so they would argue that, oh, you should give, women the vote because then white women can counteract the black vote in the South. So we see racism penetrates through gender as well. So this is not a source that goes really along with women's rights, but we're going to get more into racial issues, as you can kind of see already going there when looking at women getting involved in reform and everything like that. And so what I want you to do is to read this primary source, which is the actual Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson, and I want you to write a thesis, which is basically an argument. But what I want you to do is write an argument that you could prove using this source. So I'm going to read it out loud to you, and then you can pause it and read it as many times as you want. The object of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law. But in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. Laws permitting and even requiring their separation in places where they are liable to be brought into contact do not necessarily imply the inferiority of either race to the other, and have been generally, if not universally, recognized as within the competency of the state legislatures in the exercise of their police power. We consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this to be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. So think about this source. What argument could you make that this source could prove?